Okay, so today we're going to talk about how much paint you should use on your Gelli plate. And to be honest, there's no rules about what is right or what is wrong, but you'll get different effects depending on how much paint you use. And you might be wondering why prints are not turning out the way that you like. And hopefully I can clear up some of those issues for you today. So let's start off. I've just got my Gelli plate and my brayer, and I'm just going to use a stencil to demonstrate today. It's a fairly common way to use a Gelli plate. Okay, let's start off by looking at what happens if you don't use enough paint. So just a small amount on the plate. Now, when you don't use a lot of paint, you can see I'm getting a very, very, very thin layer of paint on the plate there. And it's harder to distribute the paint over the plate evenly. You can see there's not much happening there. So let's see what happens when we try and print that. Very, very light. Now the plate's actually, the paper's actually sticking to the plate, so there's a little bit of moisture in that paint. The problem with not enough paint is that it dries very, very quickly. And if you put the paper down onto dry paint, it won't transfer. Okay, let's have a look and see what happens. Okay, yeah, as you can see there, I hardly removed any of the paint. Very, very light amount of paint because it was too dry when I put the paper on. When I remove the stencil, the ghost print is pretty faint as well. And it's probably, it's already touch dry. So I'll just use a bit of white paint to remove that print. We'll see what we get. So it's not wrong to do it like that. You might want a really, really faint print. But if your paper's not picking your paint up, it might be because you're not using enough paint and it's drying too quickly on the plate. Have a really close look. Hardly any paint is removed there. Okay, let's have a look what's happening here. Okay, when I added another layer of paint on there, it's actually reactivated the red paint and picked most of it up. That's quite nice. That's quite a nice effect. Okay, let's try too much paint. Yep. Okay, you can see they're fairly big blobs of paint. All right, so what you notice when you're rolling that over, it rolls over very, very quickly, and there's a heap of paint on your brayer. There's a heap of paint on the plate, and it looks really wet, and it's got a little vein, sort of a vein-like appearance. Okay, I need to get rid of that paint. There's actually enough paint on that brayer there for a whole print. But let me show you what happens if you try and print when your paint is that wet. I'll put my stencil down. Now, whoop, I just felt the stencil slipping around a little bit then because there's so much paint on there, the stencil just doesn't adhere to the plate. So I'm going to get a pretty blurry old pattern. Look, the paper slipped right off. So if I lift that up, okay, so I've got lots of paint. It's a nice strong print where the stencil wasn't covering, but the edges are very fuzzy because the stencil's moved. Paint's very wet still, okay, really wet. And I've got enough paint left on there for at least another print, probably 2 more prints. So let's pull that print again. This is going to take a fair while to dry, where if you notice this one, instantly dry. All right, I'm trying to press down. I'm trying to get into all the little grooves and nooks and crannies of that stencil. Try and get a nice clean print with sharp edges. As I said, you mightn't want sharp edges on your prints, but in this case, I'm trying to get a nice sharp edge. Let's have a little look. Okay. Obviously, not as much paint there, but you can see it's uneven. I've got good coverage there, not very well covered there. Okay, the edges are pretty fuzzy. It's not a terrible effect, but not quite what I'm looking for. And if you look at the Gelli plate, you can see there's still quite a bit of paint left on the plate. Okay. I'm going to remove the stencil. Now, one thing about having a lot of paint is it actually leaves a lot more paint under the stencil. The stencil doesn't pick the paint up and take it away from the plate, so that can be a good thing. But I'm going to have to dry that before I try and pull that print. Or, because it's still wet, I could actually just use tissue paper or any sort of paper. And I'll get an interesting print from that. So, too much paint's not a bad thing. You can do quite a few different things, but you just may not get a really sharp, crisp edge to your, especially if you're using a stencil. All right, you can see. So I've got a nice abstract sort of print there with the tissue paper. And I've still got quite a bit of paint on the plate. Okay, so I'm going to dry that now. Oh. Okay, it just needs to be touch dry. You can see here, this is still really wet. That's actually still damp. So all of the prints are still wet. I've left a lot of paint on my stencil, and the stencil's a bit damp too, so I'm going to have to leave that to dry. This one's a little bit drier. No, it's still damp. No good. But on the bright side, I've got 4 different prints using the one amount of paint, which is good, so I haven't totally wasted the paint. But this time I'm going to try and pull this print. I've got a feeling this one's going to be quite nice. So if you notice that your stencil's slipping around, you're not getting crisp edges, you're not pulling all the paint off the gel plate, and everything's pretty wet, it's probably because you've got too much paint. Okay, but on the bright side, you can get 4, maybe 5 different prints. 4 I'm going to get. Okay. You can notice on the back of my paper that the paper's a little bit damp. You can see it sort of buckling and bubbling a little bit, which means I probably used a little bit too much of the white paint to pull it. So I'm going to have to dry that with the hairdryer. I try and pull a print when the paper's damp. You're likely to rip your paper. And also it means that the paint's not dry underneath, so you won't pull up a really clean print. Okay, let's see how that looks. Paper feels dry on the back. Okay, so I have been able to remove all of the paint, and that's a cool print actually. That's really nice. But that's the 4th print, so I started with this one, which is still wet. Then I got, what did I do next? Then I got that one, okay, strong print. Then I got a tissue paper print, and then I got a ghost print. So I didn't waste the paint, but it wasn't what I was hoping for in the first place. All right, let me show you how much is the right amount of paint and what it will look like on the Gelli plate. Now, what I'm looking for is the paint. It takes a little while to roll it out. I actually think I've used a little bit too much there because it looks pretty wet. But what I'm looking for is a nice velvety appearance. So it still looks like it's wet, but there's no raised amounts of paint. There's no sort of veins in it. I just removed a little bit, and I'm just going to run my brayer over it one last time. As the paint gets drier, your brayer will start to pull the paint off. So if you have a look at that, it's quite velvety. You can still see it's a little bit damp, but now this is where I need to lay down my stencil paper. Still need to work quickly because if the paint dries, if you're too slow and the paint dries, then you won't be able to pull the print straight away. All right, let's get my finger into all those little grooves. And you've got the right amount of paint too. You can rub the paper and you're not worried that the stencil's going to slip and slide because the stencil's firmly fixed to the Gelli plate. All right, now I don't think I'm going to need to use a hairdryer because the back of my paper is not damp. Let's just have a little look and see what happens. Okay. All right. So you can see there the difference between the sharpness of the print. I probably could have used a little bit more paint here. I've rolled a bit too much off with the brayer, but it's much sharper. And then when I take this off, you don't get a strong ghost print because the paint obviously dried a little more quickly under there. The stencil removed a little bit more paint. So if you want a stronger ghost print, you probably need a little bit more paint. But that's going to look kind of cool. Needs to be touch dry before I put the next layer of paint on. Forgot to mention when you use too much paint, we could have just done one print and left it to dry for a lot longer. You know, you might have needed to leave it for an hour, a couple of hours, depending on how hot the day is. But I don't have time for that, so I try not to use too much paint. Okay, let's see what sort of print we get this time. Just going to use a little bit of white paint. All right, so I'm verging on not a lot of paint there, but it's going to be enough to cover the gel plate without leaving any dry patches. I'm going to have to work quickly to pull that print. Okay, that top layer of paint needs to be damp. It needs to have some moisture in it before you put the paper on top. Otherwise, it will just stay on the Gelli plate. but you also need enough of it to activate the dry paint that's underneath. Okay, let's have a look. Just give it a bit more time. Hadn't quite picked up every little bit there, which might mean that I could have done with a little bit more white paint. Like I said, it's a bit of a trial and error, a bit of practice. Sometimes the mistake prints are the best ones too. So don't be worried about making mistakes. There we go. That's pulling off nicely. Okay, a lot different ghost print from this one. They both are good, but that's a lot cleaner. So if you want a clean print, but you can see there that there's still some red that was left on the plate. Okay, if you have a look at my stencil, it's mostly clean. This little bit didn't come off, probably because it was a bit dry before I put the paper down. So, a bit of a summary. Not enough paint. Still a pretty print. Too much paint, but the good thing is that I actually got a few prints from that one pull, and what I would consider the right amount of paint, and we get a cleaner pull, and it cleans the jelly plate. Hope this has been helpful. See you next time. Bye.